The pristine halls of the Galactic Defense Force Academy stretched before Private Jessica Miller like a cathedral built by giants. Her standard-issue boots, the only human-designed equipment she'd been allowed to keep, echoed against metal floors designed for hover-equipped aliens. Each step felt like a thunderclap in the sudden silence that had fallen over the assembled cadets. The entrance hall soared overhead, its crystalline dome capturing and refracting the light of 3 different suns. Jessica forced herself not to gawk at the architectural marvel, keeping her eyes level despite the dizzying array of alien forms that filled her peripheral vision. Hundreds of beings, representing the galaxy's most advanced species, stood in formations that seemed chaotic to human eyes, but undoubtedly followed some higher geometric logic. A Nexer cadet, its translucent body pulsing with neural light patterns, nudged its gelatinous neighbor. "Look at those rigid leg supports," it transmitted, forgetting or ignoring that the neural translator in Jessica's ear could pick up their supposedly private channel. How did they even achieve spaceflight with such limited mobility? "I heard they still use chemical propulsion for their personal vehicles," the neighbor rippled back, its thoughts tinged with amused condescension. "And their neural architecture is completely isolated. No collective processing at all." Jessica maintained her march forward, remembering her instructor's words back on Earth. "Let them underestimate us. It's the one advantage we've always had." Her credentials had earned her this spot. The first human accepted into the Academy in its 1,000-year history. But credentials meant nothing to species that considered written language a quaint relic. Commander Zextal's arrival silenced even the telepathic chatter. His crystalline exoskeleton, a marvel of evolved engineering, caught the light and split it into impossible colors as he descended from his gravity-defying command platform. At 12 feet tall, he towered over Jessica, his compound eyes reflecting her image back at her from dozens of angles. "So," he rumbled, his translator struggling to convert the complex harmonics of his native speech. "This is Earth's finest. Tell me, Private Miller, how does your species compensate for having only 2 sets of environmental sensors?" He gestured to his own sensor arrays, the compound eyes, thermal pits, electromagnetic detectors, and quantum state analyzers that studded his carapace. Jessica stood at attention, letting a small smile play at the corners of her mouth. "We observe, sir. We adapt. We overcome." A ripple of what might have been laughter moved through the assembled cadets. A swarm mind representative, its multiple bodies moving in perfect synchronization, stepped forward. "Commander, surely this is a diplomatic courtesy enrollment. The human cannot be expected to compete with evolved forms. Their species still requires periodic unconsciousness for neural maintenance." "That assessment is noted, Cadet Zirel," Commander Zextal responded, his tone unreadable. "However, the Academy Selection Council has approved Private Miller's application. She will receive the same training and face the same challenges as any other cadet." Jessica's smile didn't waver. They hadn't noticed her slight emphasis on the word observe, hadn't realized she was already cataloging their reactions, their movements, their assumptions. Her limited human senses had already picked up the subtle vibrations in the floor that telegraphed the swarm mind's movements, the slight delay in the Nexer's neural pulses that suggested decision-making patterns. "Your assigned quarters are in Complex 9, level Redshift," Commander Zextal announced, his tone suggesting he expected her to request clarification of the 4-dimensional directions. "Training begins at First Apex tomorrow. Do not be late." "Understood, sir," Jessica responded crisply, already mentally reviewing the contraband paper maps she'd memorized. The Academy's quantum-shifted architecture was designed to be navigated by neural networks and collective intelligence sharing, but humans had been finding their way through mazes since before they had written language. As she turned to leave, her modified translator picked up one last comment, this one from a silicon-based life form whose crystalline thoughts leaked electromagnetic interference. "At least it will be entertaining to watch it try." Jessica kept walking, her measured steps carrying her toward Complex 9. Let them laugh. Let them mock. Training day would come soon enough. They had no idea what humans could do with something to prove. Jessica's first morning at the academy began with her gravity failing. She woke to find herself floating 6 feet above her bunk, her standard issue blanket drifting lazily around her like a lost cloud. Through the quantum glass window, she could see several of her classmates hovering outside, their bodies perfectly controlled in the zero-G environment as they recorded her predicament on their neural feeds. Having trouble with basic environmental controls, human. The neck circaded from yesterday pulsed with smug bioluminescence. Perhaps you prefer a more primitive accommodation. Jessica ignored them, focusing instead on the control panel that was, naturally, designed for beings with tentacles and multiple limbs. The Academy's standard neural interface lay discarded on her bedside table. The device had given her a splitting headache when she tried to integrate with it last night. Instead, she pulled a roll of Earth's finest technology from her boot. Duct tape. As she drifted, she carefully wrapped one end around her wrist, creating a makeshift anchor point. The other end went around the gravity control's primary tendril slot, allowing her to manipulate it without needing extra appendages. Fascinating improvisation, a quiet voice commented from her doorway. Commander Zextal stood there, his crystalline form refracting the morning light, though hardly regulation. "No, sir," Jessica agreed, finally getting the gravity to normalize. She landed in a crouch on her feet, another advantage her classmates hadn't noticed. Humans were very good at falling. But the regulations don't specify how controls should be operated, only that they must be operated correctly. The commander's compound eyes shifted through several spectrums before he responded. "An interesting interpretation. You have advanced xenophysics in 10 minutes. Try not to disappoint Earth further." The day spiraled into a series of what her classmates clearly expected to be humiliating failures. The telepathic interfaces in xenophysics were calibrated for group mind species, overwhelming her single consciousness with a flood of unfiltered data. The quantum engineering lab's tools kept phasing through her temporally static hands. During afternoon combat training, she accidentally triggered a hive mind's personal space bubble, causing a cascade of empathic feedback that left half the class with psychic hiccups. But what they didn't notice, what even Commander Zextal almost missed, were the adjustments she made after each failure. The telepathic interfaces got easier to handle once she realized they worked like noise-canceling headphones in reverse. The quantum tools stayed solid when she hummed at exactly the right frequency. And the hive mind's bubble, once understood, proved fascinating in its predictable patterns. That evening, while her classmates engaged in collective neural recreation, Jessica sat cross-legged on her bunk with an actual paper notebook. Page after page filled with diagrams, observations, and calculations. The Nexer's light patterns corresponded to specific thought processes. The silicon beings telegraphed their movements through subtle electromagnetic changes. Even the four-dimensional architecture of the Academy followed patterns, if you knew how to look for them. A soft chime interrupted her note-taking. The door dissolved to reveal Commander Zextal, holding her discarded neural interface. "Explain," he demanded, placing the device on her desk. Jessica met his gaze steadily. "It's not broken, sir. I modified it. With adhesive strips and metal wire. The interface was designed for beings with distributed nervous systems," she explained. "Humans process information centrally. I had to add a buffer to prevent neural feedback." The commander picked up her notebook, his sensory arrays scanning the hand-drawn diagrams. "These observations, you made all of these today. Humans are good at pattern recognition, sir. It's how we survived before we had technology. We had to understand our environment and our predators to stay alive." Commander Zextal was silent for a long moment, his crystalline form shifting through colors she suspected represented deep thought. Finally, he returned her notebook. "The Academy has protocols against maintaining physical records." "Yes, sir. The protocols specify no unauthorized digital or quantum storage devices. They don't mention paper." Another long pause. "Carry on," Private Miller. Tomorrow's classes will involve atmospheric adaptation. Try not to asphyxiate. After he left, Jessica returned to her notes, adding one more observation. Even crystalline beings could express surprise through color shifts. She'd have to remember that for training day. The tactical simulation chamber hummed with quantum energy as the day's challenge materialized around the assembled cadets. The Nebula Siege scenario was legendary at the Academy. No class had solved it in over 50 years. Holographic representations of the Caraxes Nebula's swirling gases filled the vast room, while simulated enemy positions glowed as threat markers among the stellar clouds. The parameters are simple, Commander Zextal announced, his crystalline form reflecting the nebula's colors. Your task force must break the siege of Colony 7 without losing more than 30% of your fleet. You have 1 standard hour to present your solution. Jessica watched as her classmates immediately split into their evolutionary groupings. The hive minds linked into their battle meshes. The silicon beings established quantum resonance patterns. The energy-based species merged into their combat matrices. She sat alone, her primitive human brain working with only 2 hemispheres and 0 collective processing power. But she smiled as she pulled out her contraband notebook, already filled with observations about how each species approached combat. 50 minutes later, the Swarm Mind representative stepped forward to present the class's consolidated solution. Standard doctrine indicates a 3-pronged assault through these vectors. It gestured with multiple limbs at once. Our collective processing has optimized the approach angles to minimize exposure to enemy fire. A logical solution, Commander Zextal noted, and one that has failed 726 times. He turned his compound eyes toward Jessica. Private Miller, you haven't contributed to the collective strategy. Perhaps humans lack the processing power to comprehend such complex tactical scenarios. Jessica stood, tucking her notebook away. Permission to approach the tactical display, sir. The commander's crystalline form shifted to a shade she'd learned indicated amusement. Granted. Let us see Earth's primitive wisdom. Jessica walked to the holographic display, noting how her classmates moved back slightly, as if afraid her humanity might be contagious. She took a deep breath and began. The standard solution fails because it's exactly what the enemy expects. They'd had 50 years to perfect their countermeasures. So instead of fighting on their terms, she manipulated the display with her duct tape modified controls. We fight on ours. The simulation shifted as she input her strategy. First, we launch a conventional attack, but it's a feint. While they're focused on our main force, we send automated drones into the nebula's gas clouds. Not to attack, but to do this. The holographic gases began to shift and swirl in new patterns. Several of her classmates made sounds of confusion or disgust. You're disrupting the nebula's natural patterns, a silicon being observed. This creates chaos in the combat space. Exactly, Jessica grinned. Humans call it shooting up the smoke, but that's just step 1. While they're adjusting to the new sensor conditions, our real attack comes from here. She highlighted a vector that seemed to pass directly through a stellar phenomenon. They'll think this approach is suicide because of the radiation levels. It is suicide. The Nexer cadet pulsed irritably. No shielding can withstand that flux. Unless, Jessica continued, you've noticed that the radiation follows a pulse pattern. There's a 3-second window between each surge. Human gunners in our ancient navies used to time their shots between wave crests. Same principle, different scale. The simulation played out as she spoke. Her small attack force, timing its micro-jumps between radiation pulses, emerged behind the enemy fleet just as they were dealing with the chaos in the nebula. The result was devastating. Silence fell in the chamber. Commander Zextal's color shifted through several spectrums before he spoke. This strategy, it violates 17 principles of civilized combat. Yes, sir, Jessica agreed. It also wins. Sometimes the most effective weapon is the one your enemy considers too primitive to defend against. But this is barbaric. A hive mind protested. using natural phenomena as weapons, deliberately creating chaos, exploiting temporal gaps. We call it asymmetric warfare, Jessica replied calmly. When you can't match your enemy's strength, you change the rules of engagement. She paused, then added, humans have a lot of experience being the technologically inferior force. We've learned to be creative. The commander studied her for a long moment. Simulation validated. Success rate, 97%. His voice carried an undertone she couldn't quite interpret. Class dismissed. Private Miller, remain behind. As her classmates filed out, Jessica caught fragments of their conversations. Unpredictable, they whispered. Dangerous. And most interestingly, perhaps we underestimated. She smiled. They were finally starting to understand. Third medical visit this week, Private Miller. The Academy's chief medical officer, Dr. Vex, waved his sensory appendages over Jessica's form. His gelatinous body rippled with what she learned to recognize as concern. Your species' maintenance requirements are remarkably high. Jessica lay still on the examination platform, trying not to shiver as the medical scanners probed her body. The Academy's standard atmosphere mix, optimized for a dozen different alien physiologies, played havoc with her human respiratory system. Her atmospheric filter had malfunctioned again, leading to another bout of what her classmates called environmental weakness. Just another filter calibration. Sir, she managed between controlled breaths. The standard units aren't designed for human oxygen requirements. From the next treatment pod, a Nexer cadet pulsed with amusement. Perhaps we should request a terrarium for our delicate earth bloom. With proper primitive atmospheric conditions. Jessica ignored the taunt, focusing instead on Dr. Vex's readings. Your blood oxygen levels are surprisingly stable despite the filter malfunction, he noted. Most species would have triggered emergency stasis. Humans are good at managing oxygen debt, she explained. Our ancestors had to chase prey until it collapsed from exhaustion. We evolved to keep going even when our bodies want to quit. The doctor's ripples took on a different pattern. Fascinating, yet highly inefficient compared to evolved hunting adaptations like venom or superior speed. Efficiency isn't everything, Jessica replied, thinking of her morning's observations. She'd noticed how the venomous species tired quickly after using their natural weapons, how the high-speed hunters needed recovery periods between sprints. Her thoughts were interrupted as Commander Zextal entered the medical bay. Private Miller, you missed the beginning of extended environment training. Yes, sir. Sorry, sir. Filter malfunction. So I see. The commander's crystalline form shifted colors. Perhaps this experiment has reached its natural conclusion. Even your remarkable adaptability cannot overcome basic biological limitations. Jessica sat up slowly, careful to regulate her breathing. Permission to rejoin training, sir. Your oxygen levels are still suboptimal, Dr. Vex protested. They're sufficient, Jessica countered. Humans operate just fine at 80% capacity. The commander studied her for a long moment. Very well. Today's exercise involves crossing the plasma fields. Try not to expire in front of the entire class. 20 minutes later, Jessica stood with her classmates at the edge of the Academy's plasma training field. Ribbons of energy danced across the 100-meter expanse, creating an ever-shifting maze of lethal barriers. The goal is simple, Commander Zextal announced. Cross the field without touching the plasma streams. Your natural defenses and evolved capabilities should make this straightforward. Jessica watched as her classmates demonstrated their advantages. The silicon beings simply phased through the energy. The Nexer used their electromagnetic control to push the plasma aside. The hive minds linked into neural networks to calculate perfect paths through the maze. Then it was her turn. Without natural defenses, without evolved capabilities, with nothing but her primitive human body operating at 80% oxygen efficiency. She stepped forward, her classmates watching with anticipated amusement. But what they didn't know, what they hadn't noticed during their own crossings, was how the plasma streams followed patterns. patterns a predator species evolved to recognize. Jessica began to move, not quickly like the others, but with deliberate, energy-conserving motions. Where they had forced their way through, she flowed around. Where they had relied on biological advantages, she relied on reading the field's rhythm. Her oxygen-starved muscles protested, but generations of persistent hunters had taught humans to ignore such protests. She reached the other side without a single plasma touch, her breathing controlled but her legs shaking with effort. "Interesting," Commander Zextel noted. "You took 3 times longer than your classmates." "Yes, sir," Jessica managed between breaths. "But I used less than half the energy they did." She gestured to where several of her classmates showed signs of post-power exhaustion. Sometimes endurance beats raw capability. The commander's color shifted to that peculiar shade she still couldn't quite interpret. A primitive approach, but effective. He turned to address the class. "Tomorrow's exercise will test prolonged exertion. I suggest you all rest, even those of you with superior biology." As they filed out, Jessica caught him studying her medical readings on his data feed. She smiled slightly. Let them think her human needs were weaknesses. Training day would show them what humans could do with limitations. The weapons qualification test had gone exactly as badly as Jessica had expected. The standard-issue plasma rifle, designed for species with multiple limbs and enhanced strength, sat on the testing bench like a mockery of her human limitations. Around her, scattered components from her failed attempts at firing the weapon painted a clear picture of defeat. Perhaps we could requisition a simple projectile weapon for the human. The swarm-mind weapons instructor's voice dripped with false sympathy. Something more suited to her. Evolutionary level. The testing chamber still hummed with the echoes of her classmates' perfect scores. The Nexer had achieved quantum-level precision with their shots. The silicon beings had integrated directly with their weapons targeting systems. Even the gelatinous species had managed to manipulate the rifles through osmotic control. Jessica had managed to drop the weapon 3 times before misfiring into the ceiling. "That won't be necessary," she replied, her voice steady despite the humiliation burning in her chest. "I'd like to request access to the engineering lab." Commander Zextel, who had observed her failure in silence, shifted his crystalline form. "The engineering lab is for maintenance and repairs, not remedial training." "I understand, sir, but according to Academy regulations, cadets are permitted to modify their equipment within safety parameters." She met his compound eyes. "I've been taking notes on the weapon's design flaws." "Flaws?" The swarm mind instructor's multiple forms vibrated with indignation. "This is the most advanced small arms technology in the galaxy. Advanced for beings with multiple limbs and exoskeletons," Jessica agreed. "But every tool can be improved." She pulled out her notebook, flipping to pages of detailed diagrams. "I've been studying how each species interfaces with their weapons. There are patterns we can adapt." The commander studied her notes, his crystalline surface reflecting complex color patterns. "You have 3 days until the final qualification test. The engineering lab is yours until then." He paused, adding, "Try not to destroy our most advanced technology with your primitive modifications." Jessica worked through the night, surrounded by holographic schematics and disassembled components. She'd noticed how the Nexer manipulated plasma flow through electromagnetic fields, fields that could be replicated mechanically. The silicon being's targeting integration could be approximated with modified optical sights. Even the hive mind's neural linking had an analog in human muscle memory. Hour after hour, she combined elements that should not have worked together. Earth metallurgy met quantum circuitry. Simple mechanical solutions bridged gaps between advanced systems. Her duct tape made more than one appearance. Commander Zextel found her on the 3rd day, surrounded by empty stimulant packets and hybrid weapons that defied classification. "Explain," he demanded, lifting what had once been a standard plasma rifle. Jessica stood, fighting exhaustion. "Humans don't just use tools, sir. We reshape them, make them part of us." She took the weapon, demonstrating the modifications. The grip is reformed to work with human hand structure. The weight is redistributed for bipedal balance. The targeting system now projects directly onto standard human optical nerves. These modifications violate 17 different design principles. Yes, sir, but they work. She turned to the testing range that occupied one wall of the lab. Permission to demonstrate. At his nod, she took her stance. The hybrid weapon hummed to life, its systems adapting to her body just as she had adapted to the academy. She fired and fired again, each shot finding its mark with devastating precision. Impossible. The swarm mind instructor buzzed from the doorway. The human has no targeting mesh, no neural integration. No evolved advantages, Jessica finished, lowering the weapon. Just the ability to change our tools instead of waiting for evolution to change us. She met the commander's gaze. Humans got tired of waiting for better claws, so we made spears. Got tired of waiting for wings, so we built ships. We modify our tools because we had to modify ourselves. Commander Zextel's color shifted through several spectrums before settling on one she'd never seen before. Report for qualification testing tomorrow, Private Miller. He turned to leave, then added, and submit your modifications to the Academy's Weapons Division. They may find your primitive solutions instructive. As Jessica began reassembling her remaining prototypes, she smiled. They were finally beginning to understand that human primitive didn't mean what they thought it meant. The Academy's preparation hall thrummed with nervous energy on the night before training day. Hundreds of cadets made their final adjustments to equipment and armor, each according to their species' traditions. The Nexer pulsed with rapid-fire neural downloads of combat data. Silicon beings resonated in quantum harmony, aligning their crystalline structures for maximum efficiency. Hive minds linked into vast tactical networks, sharing strategies through their collective consciousness. Jessica sat alone in her corner, surrounded by what looked like a scrapyard of hybrid technology. Her modified armor lay in pieces around her, each component telling a story of human adaptation. The standard-issue quantum alloy plates had been restructured, their weight distribution optimized for human biomechanics. The neural interface was bypassed in favor of a simpler system based on muscle memory and reflex enhancement. Your species' obsession with physical preparation is fascinating, Commander Zextal observed, approaching her workspace. The others simply upload their combat protocols. Humans learn better by doing, sir, Jessica replied, adjusting a servo assist joint she'd rebuilt from scratch. Our muscles need to understand the movements, not just our minds. The commander's crystalline form shifted through analytical spectrums as he studied her modifications. The betting pools heavily favor the Manted twins. Their precognitive abilities have never been defeated in training scenarios. Yes, sir. I've been watching them. She pulled out her notebook, flipping to pages of detailed observations. Their precognition has patterns, limitations. You've been studying your classmates' weaknesses. It wasn't a question. I prefer to think of it as understanding their strengths. Jessica smiled slightly. Humans had to understand predators to survive them. Old habits die hard. A ripple of excitement passed through the hall as the Manted twins entered. Their chitinous forms gleamed with bio-enhanced combat modifications, their compound eyes shifting through probability spectrums as they analyzed potential futures. They moved with perfect coordination, each motion calculated through their shared precognitive field. We see your defeat, Earthborn. They chittered in unison, mandibles clicking in what might have been amusement. Every probability stream ends in your failure. Jessica continued her preparations without looking up. Interesting. Did you see what I had for breakfast this morning? The twins' antennae twitched in confusion. Our precognition does not waste energy on such trivial matters. Exactly. She tested a joint connection, satisfied with the smooth motion. You see what you expect to see. What you think is important enough to see. The commander's color pattern shifted to something she learned to recognize as intense curiosity. Explain. The Mantid's precognition is based on probability calculation, Jessica said, making another minor adjustment to her armor. But they can only calculate probabilities for actions they understand and consider significant. They've never fought a human before, never had to calculate the probabilities of what we might consider important. The twins' mandibles clicked rapidly. Your primitive tactics cannot overcome evolutionary superiority. We have seen every possible combat scenario. Every scenario you can imagine, Jessica corrected quietly. But humans, we're good at imagining things that have never existed before. It's how we survived against faster, stronger predators. We thought of solutions they couldn't predict. She stood, testing the weight of her modified armor. Each piece represented hours of observation, adaptation, and innovation. The neural damper she'd installed would help against psychic attacks. The reflex enhancers were calibrated specifically for human reaction times. Even her boots had been rebuilt to take advantage of human locomotive patterns. The training course opens at first light, Commander Zextal announced. I suggest all cadets get sufficient rest. As the others filed out, Jessica remained, making one final check of her equipment. The commander lingered, his crystalline form refracting the evening light. You understand the statistics, Private Miller. No human has ever completed the Academy's training course. Jessica smiled, closing her notebook filled with 3 months of careful observations. That's the wonderful thing about humans, sir. We had a long history of doing things that have never been done before. She couldn't be certain, but as he left, she thought she saw his color shift to the same pattern he'd shown when she'd solved the Nebula Siege scenario, something between worry and anticipation. Tomorrow would show them all what humans could really do, not despite their limitations, but because of them. The training course sprawled across 5 dimensions of space, its quantum-shifted landscape defying standard geometry. Holographic barriers sparked with lethal energy, while gravity wells and radiation zones created an ever-shifting maze of environmental hazards. At the starting line, 200 of the galaxy's most advanced beings waited for their chance to prove their evolution superior. Jessica stood at her assigned position, running through final equipment checks. Her modified armor hummed with jury-rigged enhancements, each piece a testament to human ingenuity. The manted twins, positioned nearby, chittered in amusement. Your defeat is still certain, Earthborn, they synchronized. We see every move you will make. Commander Zexel's voice cut through the pretrial tension. Cadets, your objective is simple. Reach the quantum beacon at the center of the course. All weapons are set to training intensity. Environmental hazards remain lethal. Begin. The first wave of cadets surged forward, each species showcasing their evolutionary advantages. Silicon beings phased through solid barriers. Nexar manipulated electromagnetic fields to clear paths. Hive minds linked into combat networks, coordinating their movements with perfect precision. Jessica waited, watching. 3 months of observation had taught her that every species had patterns they didn't even recognize in themselves. The manted twins launched into action, their precognitive abilities allowing them to navigate the hazards with fluid grace. They moved like dancers through the chaos, always one step ahead of danger. Behind them, the first casualties began. A silicon being, phasing at the wrong moment, caught in a gravity well. A Nexar, its electromagnetic control disrupted by a radiation surge. Then Jessica moved. Not with the fluid grace of the mantids or the perfect coordination of the hive minds. She moved like what she was, a human who had learned to survive by understanding her environment and adapting to it. Where others avoided the radiation zones, she used them as cover, her modified armor's shielding calibrated specifically for these frequencies. When a gravity well opened beneath her, she didn't fight it. She rode it, using the momentum to launch herself past a cluster of energy barriers. Her movements weren't beautiful or efficient, but they were effective. Impossible. The manted twins' synchronization faltered as they watched her slip through gaps they hadn't even seen. Our precognition shows what you expect to see, Jessica called back, ducking under a quantum phase shift. But humans don't always do what's expected. She demonstrated by throwing herself directly at a lethal energy barrier, then dropping and sliding beneath it at the last second, using the smooth surface of her armor's backplates like a primitive skateboard. The maneuver carried her past 3 more hazards before she rolled to her feet. The Mantid's perfect coordination began to break down as they tried to track her increasingly unpredictable movements. Their precognition, trained to anticipate logical, efficient actions, struggled with her seemingly chaotic approach. Your tactics defy rational combat doctrine. One of them chittered in frustration. Humans survived on Earth by being unpredictable, Jessica replied, using her momentum to swing around a gravity pole. Predators can't anticipate what they don't understand. She reached into a pouch and pulled out a handful of small objects, simple metal bearings, scavenged from the engineering lab. With practiced aim, she scattered them across the quantum-shifted floor. The tiny spheres rolled in impossible patterns, disrupting the course's carefully calibrated gravity fields. Chaos erupted as the environmental hazards began to interact in ways the course designers had never anticipated. Energy barriers flickered, radiation zones shifted, and gravity wells merged unpredictably. Most of the remaining cadets froze, their evolved instincts and combat protocols useless in the face of such disorder. But Jessica kept moving. She'd spent 3 months studying not just her classmates, but the course itself. Every system had patterns, and patterns could be disrupted. As she approached the central beacon, her path looked random, even reckless. But each movement was calculated, based on hundreds of hours of observation and the most primitive of human skills: pattern recognition and tool use. The Mantid twins made one final attempt to intercept her, their precognition stretching to its limits. But Jessica had saved one last surprise. She threw her notebook at them. The simple paper object, completely absent from their probability calculations, caused them to hesitate for a crucial second. That second was all she needed. With a final burst of speed, Jessica reached the quantum beacon. The course powered down, leaving her standing at the center of the galaxy's most advanced training facility, surrounded by the stunned representatives of 100 evolved species. Commander Zextal's crystalline form shifted through colors she'd never seen before as he announced, "Course completed. New Academy record established." The Academy's graduation ceremony blazed with the light of 3 suns, their rays fracturing through the crystalline dome into impossible colors. 200 of the galaxy's most advanced beings stood in formation, their evolved forms resplendent in ceremonial armor. And among them, looking deceptively ordinary in her modified gear, stood Private Jessica Miller, the first human to ever complete the Academy's training. 3 standard months ago, Commander Zextal addressed the assembled graduates, his crystalline form shifting through formal color patterns. "We welcomed Earth's first representative to these halls." Many questioned this decision. Some called it a diplomatic courtesy. Others suggested it would prove, once and for all, that less evolved species had no place among the stars. The commander's color shifted to what Jessica now recognized as amusement. Those voices have gone remarkably quiet since training day. A ripple of movement passed through the assembled cadets. The Mantid twins' antennae twitched in what might have been embarrassment. The Nexer's neural patterns pulsed with revised calculations. What we witnessed was not merely a victory of physical prowess or tactical thinking, the commander continued. It was a demonstration of something our advanced civilizations had forgotten. Something humans never had the luxury of forgetting. He turned to face Jessica directly. "Private Miller, your species lacks almost every evolutionary advantage we consider essential. You have no natural weapons, no enhanced senses, no collective consciousness. By every measurable standard, humans are physically inferior to even our least evolved members." Jessica stood at attention, fighting back a smile. She'd heard variations of this speech for 3 months, but this time felt different. And yet, the commander's tone shifted. "You transformed our most advanced technology with primitive materials. You found patterns in chaos that our evolved senses missed. You turned our greatest strengths into weaknesses, simply by approaching problems from angles we had never considered. He gestured to where her modified equipment lay displayed alongside standard Academy gear. Your species never evolved better claws, so you learned to change your environment instead. You never developed natural armor, so you learned to understand and avoid threats. You never gained telepathy, so you learned to read subtle patterns that even telepaths miss. The Swarm Mind representative stepped forward. We have reviewed the training day records. Your victory was not merely impressive, it was instructive. Each of your primitive solutions revealed blind spots in our evolved capabilities. Indeed, Commander Zextal agreed, which is why the Academy Council has reached a historic decision. His color pattern shifted to formal announcement mode. Earth will be granted a full quota of Academy positions, effective immediately. Moreover, all graduates will now be required to study human adaptive strategies as part of their tactical training. Jessica blinked in surprise. Around her, the other cadets stirred with mixed reactions. The Mantid twins' mandibles clicked rapidly in private conversation. The silicon beings resonated with new harmonic patterns. But sir, one of the Nexer cadets pulsed hesitantly. Humans are still physically inferior. Their technology is centuries behind ours. Their neural architecture is isolated and limited. All true, the commander acknowledged. And yet, in 3 months, one human with primitive tools and limited capabilities forced us to reconsider centuries of tactical doctrine. Imagine what they might accomplish in years, or decades. He turned back to Jessica. Your species never evolved to match the challenges you faced. Instead, you evolved to adapt to any challenge. That capacity for adaptation, that drive to overcome seemingly impossible odds, that is an advantage we never saw coming. As the ceremony concluded, Jessica found herself surrounded by classmates who had once mocked her limitations. The Mantid twins approached first, their synchronization humbling rather than arrogant. We have reviewed our precognitive failures, they chittered. Your unpredictability. It is not a weakness as we thought. It is something new, something we must learn to understand. The Nexer cadet who had once suggested putting her in a terrarium now pulsed with curiosity. Your modified equipment. Would you be willing to explain your approach? Perhaps there are applications we have not considered. Commander Zextal's final words echoed through the hall. Let this class serve as a reminder. True evolution is not merely about developing superior capabilities. Sometimes, the most powerful adaptation is the ability to adapt itself. Jessica smiled, thinking of her battered notebook and rolls of duct tape. Humanity had finally proven itself among the stars, not by being the strongest or most advanced, but by being uniquely, unpredictably, impossibly human.